Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our Modern Ransomware Defense and Remediation Summit, brought to you by Rubrik. The editorial staff of our websites have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts for this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with two information-packed sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when that replay is available, generally within the next few days, but likely much sooner in my experience. Also, each of today's two sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And after the second session, we will be giving away a Surface Pro 8 with 256 gigabytes of storage. You must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, so we thank them for sponsoring this summit and supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, the current ransomware threat landscape and what IT pros must know. This session features Alan Liska, intelligence analyst at Recorded Future. Alan has 20 years of experience in ransomware and information security, providing ransomware-related counsel and key recommendations to major global corporations and government agencies while sitting on national ransomware task forces and speaking at global conferences. Alan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And thank you all for attending today. Very much appreciate it. We've got a lot to talk about because, as always, there is a lot going on with ransomware, and we appreciate any and all questions that you have. One of the best parts about doing these, having these discussions and having these presentations is there are always some really amazing questions that come up and some good conversation that comes out of it. So before we talk about ransomware in what's going on in 2022, let's talk a little bit about 2021. Because 2021 was a little bit weird when it comes to ransomware. First of all, we saw 21 law enforcement actions taken against ransomware groups, which was more than in the previous 4 years combined. That is, we saw arrests all around the world. We saw sanctions against cryptocurrency exchanges that ransomware actors use to mine Bitcoin. And in general, we saw a lot of activity happen. We even saw a couple of times where the government seized cryptocurrency from some of these exchanges that was used by ransomware actors. So that's kind of huge, and that's a good start. Unfortunately, we saw more ransomware victims in 2021 than in 2020. That's to be expected. We know that there were 4,500 victims posted to ransomware extortion sites, and we know that only about 10% of victims ever make it to extortion sites, so likely we're dealing with more than 45,000 known victims of ransomware attacks, and again, that number is probably even higher. According to the U.S. Treasury, in the first half of 2021, they tracked $680 million worth of ransom payments. Just a huge number, and that's spread across 30 or 40 different groups. So there are a lot of different groups out there that are engaging in activity. And as you can see from the chart in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, overall, ransomware activity continued to increase throughout 2021. There were definitely up and down months, but broadly speaking, the trend was up. With a couple of caveats. After the Colonial Pipeline attack, we did see a slowdown of ransomware attacks that was kind of a combination of some of the ransomware actors regrouping because they realized they've kind of gone a little bit too far, which is something you don't really think of. But ransomware actors can actually go too far. When the president calls your name out on national television, you screwed up bad, as they like to say. So we saw in July and August, we saw that. But also, broadly speaking, we generally see a slowdown in general in August. Even ransomware actors apparently need to take vacation. And so we usually see a dip in August anyway. But we went right back, and then you saw a bigger jump in October and November. So there's still a lot of ransomware activity going on. And ransomware has really gone global, and this is going to expand into 2022. While the nexus of ransomware cyber criminal activity is in Russia, affiliates of the ransomware as a service offerings have been arrested all over the world. And then when you add to that the fact that China and Iran appear to be adopting ransomware as a strategy. So, and what I mean by that is that they're not necessarily using it as a way to make money, although that certainly could be part of it. They're using it as a way to disrupt. So these ransomware attacks that we're seeing coming out of China and Iran are much more targeted and focused on organizations that are considered enemies of China and Iran. So we've seen, for example, a lot of Iranian ransomware activity targeting Israel. We've seen a lot of Chinese ransomware activity targeting Taiwan. But the DearCry ransomware, which appears to be a cyber criminal group out of China that's behind it, so not necessarily the Chinese government, but an actual independent cyber criminal group launching the DearCry ransomware, targeting that same vulnerability that Chinese nation-state actors were using in Microsoft Exchange, but to deploy ransomware. And if you look at it, you'll see that if you look at it, you see that while it has all the markings of traditional ransomware, we can't find any evidence of anybody successfully paying a ransom. So in effect, it's meant to be much more disruptive. And I kind of want to go back to look at this map. Forgive my art skills, if you will. These are just some of the known cases of where we saw arrests for ransomware as a service operators, so the affiliates, not necessarily the operators. We saw several in Canada. We saw a ransomware as a service affiliate arrested down in Florida, although I will note he was a Canadian citizen. There were last year, there were 4 arrests of Canadians involved in ransomware activity. And I'm pretty sure only 6 people live in Canada. So, that's like 3/4 of the country or something like that. Anyway, it's a whole lot of people coming out of Canada that seem to be involved in ransomware as a service, which is kind of surprising. We saw some activity out of Brazil, out of Ukraine, out of Romania, certainly out of Iran, out of China, out of South Korea, and there's always activity out of North Korea, and of course Russia. So really, when we talk about ransomware being global, we really are saying that it's global. Again, the main operators of the ransomware itself, and we'll talk about this in a minute, are primarily in Russia, China, and Iran. But the affiliates, the ones that are carrying out the attacks day to day, they're really spread out all over the world, and that's what we're learning from these law enforcement actions that have happened. So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a ransomware attack. And forgive me, I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this slide because I think it's really important to understand all of the different ways that ransomware actors move around the network, because understanding that is how you're going to defend yourself against the ransomware attack. And I want you to do me a favor. I'm going to get kind of like a yoga or Tai Chi instructor here for a minute. I want you to start thinking, as I'm walking through and describing how this ransomware attack works, how you would detect this activity in your network. Because that's one of the biggest problems is for a lot of these organizations, they don't think about, for a lot of organizations, they don't think about how to detect the ransomware attack until it gets to the encryption part, where all of these intermediary steps are much better ways to stop a ransomware attack. So let's talk about initial access. And the way ransomware is set up, because ransomware has gotten so big, again, that $680 million number just in the first half of 2021, it spawned a lot of cottage industries. So one of the things that you have to understand with ransomware is it's generally not the ransomware actor that's gaining that initial access. There are other criminals that are called initial access brokers, and they're the ones that generally gain that access, and then they turn around and they sell it to the ransomware actors themselves, whether it's to the operator of the ransomware as a service offering or to whether it's one of their affiliates, the people that sign up to be able to deploy their ransomware. So when you're talking about an attack like this, you're generally talking about two different types of actors, one to get the initial access and one that turns around and sells it. Think of it like flipping houses, except you're flipping networks. You're turning that network over to a ransomware actor who's then going to deploy the ransomware. And they generally sell that initial access from anywhere from a couple thousand to 10, 15, even 100,000, depending on the type of access they're able to get. So like if you have administrator access and the size of the network. But the thing is, if you're a ransomware actor, it's still a good investment, because if you're confident you can deploy the ransomware, you're going to make way more than what you're paying for that initial access. Right now, we're generally seeing 4 different entry points for initial access. So the first are phishing campaigns. And throughout 2019, throughout 2020, phishing was kind of the primary mode of entry. But what we're starting to see in 2021, and we expect this to continue into 2022, is that credential stuffing and credential reuse attacks are becoming much more common. In fact, we kind of have a joke in the industry that RDP actually stands for Ransomware Deployment Protocol instead of what it actually means. Only because RDP is one of the most common entry methods, because it's so easy for these initial access brokers to just fire up an old laptop and start scanning, looking for open RDP connections, and then trying credential stuffing, credential reuse attacks. You have to keep in mind there are literally billions of credentials that are being sold on underground markets. So while it seems like credential reuse would be a attack would be a challenge, it really isn't. You connect to the RDP server, you see what network it belongs to, you search on Genesis Market or one of the other markets for usernames and passwords that match it, and then you try those. You get 100 of them, you try them, and unfortunately, most of the time they will find a match and they'll be able to gain access. That's why multi-factor authentication is so important for any system that's exposed to the internet. And while we pick on RDP because that's sort of the low-hanging fruit, the same thing applies to Citrix. The same thing applies to basically any system that's exposed to the internet. So really, really important to keep in mind. Really, really keep in mind that this is really important as far as protecting yourself. Next, we're looking at third-party attacks, and these are increasingly common. We really saw this take off in 2021. So ransomware actor or the initial access broker gains access to a managed service provider or a vendor of some kind, and rather than deploying the ransomware with that vendor, what they do is they use that access to jump to those partners. They find it's really easy because you get to start right in the GUI center and work your way out. So we're seeing a big increase in that, and again, that goes with the certification or the sophistication, increasing sophistication of the ransomware access. And then exploitation is also growing in popularity. So, in the last year, we cataloged more than 40 different exploits that were used by ransomware groups or the initial access brokers in order to gain that first access. So really, really important that you're patching, again, anything that's public-facing, especially anything that has proof of concept code or anything like that released, has to be patched immediately. So you can see already the challenge that defenders have, right? You have 30 different ransomware groups that are really active right now, and then hundreds of initial access brokers that are working for these ransomware groups, all going after initial access using these 4 different methods. And there you see where the problem is when you're trying to defend that initial access. So that's the initial access. Once they get in the network, then they start moving around. And we see these same tools being used over and over again by these ransomware groups once they're in the network to move around. So Cobalt Strike is really, really popular right now. It gets loaded in memory. It's hard for organizations to detect. By design, that's what Cobalt Strike is meant to do. And so it's easy to use that to move, and it's kind of turnkey, right? You just run the commands that you run over and over again, and you're able to get access. Because while every network is uniquely different, if your network is built around domain controller, which most corporate networks are, and Active Directory, you can run the same commands and get the accesses you need. Other ransomware actors like to use PSExec because that's installed on almost every network that's out there. And so they know they'll have it, and if they upload it, they know it's not going to be detected by your antivirus and so on. And then they use tools like AdRecon, Metasploit, AdFind, Lasagna, Bloodhound, PowerSploit, Mimikatz, Lulvins, and Advanced IV Scanner to move around the network. They're looking for a few things. They're looking for your file servers. They're looking for any Linux servers, any ESXi servers, any Windows servers, and of course your domain controller. Domain controller is kind of the critical part. But while they're doing reconnaissance, they want to find as much information as possible. But when they're starting their encryption, they're really going to focus on those Linux, ESXi, and Windows servers. And in particular, ESXi servers have become really popular with ransomware groups. Most ransomware groups now have a variant that is specifically for ESXi servers because they know if they can encrypt that ESXi server, they can take out, a dozen or 2 dozen or even 100 servers all at the same time. And we keep seeing this over and over again with some of the newer ransomware groups where they build their variants for the ESXi servers. They don't double check the decryptors to see if the decryptor is going to handle large files. So even if you pay the ransom, you may not be able to decrypt those virtual servers. That's, again, a problem and something you really have to think about. So what they're doing right now is they're looking for important files on your network. And even the ones that don't speak English very well, they will go out of their way to, they have a list of keywords they should be looking for. They're looking for your cyber insurance policy. They're looking for financials for the organization. They're looking for email addresses. They're looking for customer data. They're looking for any of this. They're going to gather this, and then they're going to move to the next phase, exfiltration. So during exfiltration, they're going to get all the files in one place, and they're going to ship it off to whatever their command and control server is. They're also sometimes going to ship it off to mega sync, which is mega.nz. Really important, and I've started telling people this, don't have a legitimate reason to use mega.nz in your network, you should block it and all of its domains. Because so many ransomware groups have decided that is the best way to exfiltrate files out of there rather than use their own command and control server and hope that it gets there. They just send it all up to MegaSync and then pull it down from there. It's a great way for them to do it very quickly. MegaSync has tools already in place for it. So look for blocking. It's mega.nz, and there are a few other domains associated with it. Just if you can, block all access to it. And then deployment. Interestingly, because every ransomware deployment is a little bit different and a little bit custom, what I like to call, like craft brewed ransomware. they often test the ransomware on one or two machines before they do the full-scale deployment. So you should be looking for those one or two tests before it's fully deployed. During that process, they're also going to be deleting shadow copies on any machine they hit. They're going to be deleting backups. They're looking for your backup server, and they will try and delete those. And some of them have gotten sophisticated enough that they're going to cover their tracks to try and remove or roll over log files. This is really important for those of you that have MSSPs. If you're shipping your logs off-site, that can actually save you a lot of time during recovery if there is a successful ransomware attack. And then they're going to deploy the ransomware, and then depending on how negotiation and everything goes, they're going to start publishing files to their extortion sites. So that can take days to months. Sometimes they get really excited about a new victim, and they'll immediately say, hey, look at all this cool stuff that we're going to start publishing from them. Other times they'll wait. A lot of this depends on how your negotiation's going with them. If they see that there's no chance they're ever going to get paid, they will immediately start publishing files. But keep in mind that they're not just doing that. There's a whole extortion ecosystem out there. So they're not just publishing files. They will often call your customers, call your vendors and say, hey, they were hit with a ransomware attack. They'll launch DDoS attacks against you until you're willing to pay and so on. So there's a lot of different activity that goes on as part of that extortion ecosystem. So let's talk about how you defend a little bit against some of these. So again, right now the big thing we're seeing is credential stuffing and reuse. And this is in part because of all of the initial access brokers that are out there and how much work they're doing and trying to gain those accesses. Really important to enable multi-factor authentication on all publicly exposed services. And if you can, monitor underground markets for stolen credentials. I'm a big advocate of Have I Been Pwned. They offer a free service for small businesses. Put your company domain in there and find out when you have that. And then when you find stolen credentials, get those credentials changed. Remember, that's how the ransomware actors gained access to Colonial Pipeline. Is they found stolen credentials on underground markets. It was for an ex-employee, and that ex-employee had been removed from the domain controller, but not from the VPN system. And so those credentials still work there. So you really want to have a process in place for when you do find those stolen credentials, forcing password changes everywhere, and also when employees leave, making sure you're removing those credentials everywhere. You really want to keep your identity and access management program tight, because right now that's the big method that ransomware actors are going after. And next we have phishing. Obviously continuous phishing training, that's kind of the thing that everybody harps on and everybody talks about. But it's better if the phishing email never gets to the employee in the first place. So whenever possible, you really want to have strong email security systems out there, so that you really want to have those strong email security systems that are catching those emails early, looking for things like Excel documents or Google Docs that look suspicious, and blocking those and keeping them from getting there. I will say we got some good news last week in that Microsoft has formally announced that they are going to be disabling macros going forward, so that by default, so you'll manually have to turn them on, which is great. And I know I've mentioned this before, and I always get in trouble for saying it, but I'm going to say it again. Macros have been a big, big, big problem, and I like to joke that I've never met anybody who uses macros that I like anyway, so just disable them across the board as soon as possible whenever you can. Your third party, that again, that's a growing threat for ransomware groups, and a new one, and a sign of their increased sophistication. So just like you're enabling multi-factor authentication for your employees, you really have to force your third parties that have access to your network to use multi-factor authentication. You don't want them just logging in. And you'll get sometimes you get pushback from those vendors. We don't have a way of effectively managing multi-factor authentication, blah, blah, blah. Too bad, figure it out. We're paying you. This is part of the job. You've got to figure out how to do that. Highly recommend segmenting their access. So if they only need access to a certain system, make sure those credentials can't be used on any other system. Really important to keep that access tight for all of your vendors. And then monitor their vendor credential use closely. Had a recent close call with a ransomware attack that I was working on, and it came in from the ransomware attack came in from a third-party vendor. The ransomware actor accessed the system that they were supposed to access, and then tried to use those same credentials to access another server. Now, this organization I was working with had really good IAM policies in place. They got an alert as soon as that vendor credential tried to access another system. They were able to immediately isolate that server and prevent the ransomware actor from moving anywhere else. So huge, huge deal. If you can do this, if you can do vendor access management control, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache going forward. Exploitation, patch, and I know everybody you ever talk to at any one of these events says, well, you got to patch. And it's not wrong that you have to patch, but you really need to prioritize patching based on risk, not CVS scoring. So you want to prioritize patching based on, hey, is this being exploited in the wild? Is there POC code for this? How likely is this to be exploited? You want to start looking at that, not just, oh, it's got a CVSS score of 7 or above, so we have to prioritize patching. It's one of the reasons why there's so many organizations are so far behind in patching. And I want to take a step back here for a second, because I really want to emphasize this is a lot, right? This is not easy. I mean, it's easy for me to stand up here and tell you you need to do this, and none of the information that I'm telling you is wrong. Like, it's all stuff that needs to be done. But each one of these things, if you haven't enabled any of them, is a project in and of itself. And so, while I can come up here and I can tell you that it needs to be done, a lot of you are probably looking at this going, well, that's a 3 to 6 month project, and I can't do them concurrently because I don't have the staff and because I have other day-to-day responsibilities. So, I'm looking at 2 years to fully implement everything that you're talking about here, because you're talking about, getting an MFA provider and, running through all my POCs, my tests, getting the budget approved, and so on. You're talking about, finding a new vendor for email security and that whole process. You're talking about redoing my vulnerability management program. That's a really long and involved process. That's one of the ways that ransomware actors are winning right now, is simply because they have so many initial points of entry. You only have so much time and so much budget to improve these securities, but you have to take these steps moving forward. And so it's better to start planning how you're going to do it now, even knowing that it's going to take you a while before you actually get to the point where all of this is fully enabled. It's one of these cliches that's been overused in security, kind of like security people who like to quote Sun Tzu. Everybody likes to quote Mike Tyson saying, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. But ransomware really is like that. Ransomware is the ultimate punch in the face for really testing how well your plans are actually enabled and how well they're working. But I also want, if you go back to this slide, think about it in terms of boxing. Each one of these is a round. All you need is the TKO in the end. You don't necessarily need a knockout in the first round or the second round or even the third round. If you can have enough protections in place and have that defense and depth in place, you can beat the ransomware actor even if you don't quite get him the first round or the second round. So that's really where we are. So with so many different ways that ransomware groups can gain initial access, what happens when your organization misses it? What happens if you're in the middle of redoing your vulnerability management program and in the meantime the ransomware actor exploit something you have exposed to the internet, and now they're in the network. And that's really where your detection and threat hunting capabilities are so important. You want to see whether or not your organization can detect the activity happening in reconnaissance, lateral movement, and exfiltration stages. So here's some things I want you to think about going forward as you are trying to figure out whether or not you could stop a ransomware attack midstream. A big one right now: are you alerted when another process kills your endpoint solution? Ransomware actors, when they get onto a box, one of the first things they do, and there are a lot of tools that automate this for them, is they kill that endpoint protection solution. Oh, you have Windows Defender? Great, done. You have, you have Sophos, you have Symantec, you have whatever. They kill those. Same thing, even if you have an advanced EDR, they'll kill your Carbon Black, they'll kill your Sentinel-1. And so are you being alerted when another process kills your endpoint solution? So not when the computer shuts down, but when another process forces that shutdown. That's a great way to detect potential ransomware activity. So, and again, every one of these things has to be refined a little bit for every network, but it's things like this that help. Are you detecting programs or scripts that are running in memory? So, are you looking at things that are, a process that's executing and running in memory? Are you alerting on that? And the way to do that is create a allow list of things that normally run in memory and you expect them to run in memory, and then anything that's not on that list, alert on. So that way you're not inundated with alerts. You're only getting alerts on things that might be suspicious. Do you have specific detections around Cobalt Strike? There are a lot of unique features of Cobalt Strike, and the bad guys tend to use Cobalt Strike out of the box. So Cobalt Strike gives you a lot of ways to hide some of the telltale signs. The bad guys tend not to use those because they've had so much success without doing that. So are you able to detect Cobalt Strike, being operated? Are you logging PowerShell activity? There are so many organizations that don't have PowerShell logging turned on. Ransomware actors love PowerShell. And again, I get it, man. That may mean a whole lot more alerts. The idea is you then have to filter out all of the false positives, all of the bad things that are coming up, and find all the bad things that are coming up. But bad guys do love their PowerShell. So if you're logging PowerShell activity, you may have a chance of detecting them. Are you looking for large file transfers? Again, the ransomware actors aren't subtle. They'll get all the data onto a single machine, they'll zip it up, and then they'll send it off to whatever they're sending it off to. Are you monitoring those large file transfers, especially evenings and weekends, which is when ransomware actors like to operate? So looking for those things. Are you collecting information about the latest tactics and rolling that into your detection process? So everything I'm telling you here could change in 6 months. Probably not likely, not at least not in 6 months. But you have to keep up with the latest tactics and rolling that into the detection process. And remember, none of these are set it and forget it. You're constantly going to have to refine as your network changes, as the ransomware actors change tactics, as they move, as they kind of move around. You're going to have to continuously update and do this. And if you don't have the staff and the ability to do that, having your MSSP do that for you is going to be really important in making sure they have the logs and the detection capabilities that they need. So don't just wait for alerts. You really want to start hunting for new threats in your network. The last point in the previous slide where we talk about getting information about the latest tactics and rolling that into your detection process. Start with a threat hunting process. You get the intelligence about a new ransomware threat. CISA just released a great report about some of the tactics and the global expansion of ransomware. You want to take any indicators in there, and you want to run that through your threat hunting capability. So you want to start looking for those indicators immediately. Hey, here's some new intelligence. Let's look to make sure that those ransomware actors aren't hiding in our networks right now. And then you want to refine that search, reduce your false positives, and then incorporate that into your security workflow. So you're threat hunting for new indicators, new signs of a ransomware actor. that should only be a one-time thing, and then it becomes part of your regular security workflow. And then ideally, you want to send any feedback you have so that they can continue to refine their capabilities. Now, that's for indicators or signs of a ransomware actor. There are other regular threat hunting missions you should be doing, looking for unusual activity, looking for things that maybe is not an indicator, but is kind of strange. Weird logins, access to domains that are that you only have one or two accesses to in the within your network traffic. Things like that are regular threat hunting missions that you really want to engage in order to look for ransomware activity. But taking those indicators and taking indicators of ransomware activity, hunting for them, and then incorporating them into your security workflow is really important. And again, if you're not doing this, having your MSSP or your MDR do it for you is going to be really important. Make sure that they are staying on top of the latest activity. And so, in the beginning, I asked you, hey, do you currently have the ability to detect all these different types of events, or how would you detect a ransomware actor? And you may say, oh, yeah, we got it, no problem. A lot of victims that I've worked with thought the same thing. You really want to verify and test regularly, especially as you start making changes to your network. I highly recommend conducting regular tabletop exercises to ensure your detections work as expected, and make sure that everyone is prepared if all of your security precautions do fail. Regular tabletop exercises, the idea is you don't want to call anybody out. You're not trying to embarrass any one team or another. What you want to do is you actually want to make sure that the assumptions you're making about what's enabled and what detection capabilities that you have in place actually are there and are actually working as advertised. It really, really goes a long way to making sure. And you'll often find that, oh, hey, I thought we had this enabled, but we didn't. Or I thought that the tool we had that was capable of doing this didn't. And I'll throw in there, regularly do audits with your security vendor to make sure that you've enabled, to make sure you've enabled all the capabilities that you can, within your existing contract. You want to make sure that you're taking advantage of every detection capability that they're going to offer you, and that you want to do this a little bit at a time. You don't want to be suddenly overwhelmed with new alerts, but enabling new features can often, or existing features that you didn't enable the first time around, can often help improve your detection capability. So reach out, ask, work with them. Again, I always recommend making sure you get a free lunch out of it at least. But have those conversations with your vendors to make sure that you're enabling everything that you can. And then along with that, you really, really want to have an incident response plan, a tested incident response plan for dealing with a ransomware attack. And a lot of people are like, I already have an incident response plan. Why do I need one specific for ransomware? And that's because most incident response plans have to deal with, oh, hey, I have one or two servers that are down, or, I have whatever, a data center that's down. Ransomware attacks tend to be much more completely disruptive. So, and an existing incident response plan may not fully cover a ransomware attack. So make sure you're incorporating ransomware attack into your incident response plan. Make sure that incident response plan is updated, and ideally that you have a printed out copy or a copy on a thumb drive somewhere so it doesn't get encrypted. As you're thinking about your ransomware incident response plan, you really want to think about these kind of 6 steps. You want to prepare for the attack. So that means going through and making sure you're getting all the logs and everything that you would need. You want to, once you've got it, you want to identify the ransomware strain that's been hit. That is not as easy as it sounds. You'd think that, as long as it'll be in the note. It's not always in the note, especially with some of the ransomware like Brief that comes from Evil Corp. They often pretend to be other ransomware groups because you can't pay a fine. At least in the U.S., you can't pay a ransom to Evil Corp, because if the government finds out, there'll be huge fines since they are a sanctioned entity. Then you want to be able to contain the ransomware attack. So you want to, once you've spotted it, you want to isolate it as quickly as possible, eradicate the event, then start the recovery process, and then review and lessons learned from everything. So you really want to have all of those steps covered. I will say often in ransomware attacks, I kind of switch the contain and identify, because you know it's a ransomware attack. What you want to do is stop it. You want to limit the damage as quickly as possible. Then you can figure out what the ransomware is. But overall, that's what we consider kind of good incident response management. And then you want to be able to do that and move on. Don't forget, you are going to have to deal with the ransomware actors. If you're a victim, you can't just kind of ignore that part. So you really want to think about the extortion ecosystem and how that's continued to expand. You have to have a plan in place for how you're going to communicate and how you're going to share that information. These are all the different ways that ransomware actors now try to get extortion from you. Anything from obviously the stealing files to launching DOS attacks to calling your customers or your vendors. All of these things can be really, really disruptive to your organization. You have to have a plan in place for how you're going to deal with that, assuming that you're not going to pay the ransom. What happens when you start getting calls from your clients saying, hey, some ransomware actor called and said you all been hit with a ransomware attack. Are my files safe? What are you going to tell them? When your vendors start calling, and this is really, really important, I'm starting to see a trend where if an organization gets hit with a ransomware attack, vendors will cut them off. Just like you are worried about your vendors getting hit with a ransomware attack and infecting you, your vendors are worried in the same way. So if you have access into other systems and they find out that you've been hit with a ransomware attack, they will cut you off until you can, show them that that attack is fully contained. They don't want to get infected. They don't want their customers to get infected or their other vendors to get infected. So they will get you cut off. I had one vendor that I worked with that they got cut off. They had contained the ransomware attack, but they got cut off because a vendor called into the help desk. The help desk had not been briefed on what was going on and the containment that was done. And so the person at the help desk said, yeah, if we're in the middle of a ransomware attack, and the vendor said, okay, we're cutting you all off. Had the security team communicated effectively to the help desk, they could have said, look, if anybody asks, yes, we had a ransomware attack, everything's fully contained. If you need to talk to our security leadership for verification, we'll put you in touch with them. You don't want to have your business any more unnecessarily disrupted by these attacks by having your vendors cut off. So have a plan in place for how you're going to deal with this, especially if you're not paying the ransom, what you're going to tell clients in the case of schools, what you're going to tell parents, because we do see parents getting emailed from some of these attacks, and teachers and so on. So again, things to think about, things that are really, really important and that have to be part of your ransomware incident response plan. So in summary, kind of where we are right now, ransomware attacks aren't slowing down in 2022. You've got to be prepared for changing tactics, so you have to keep updated on everything that's happening. Whatever you think you can detect, you want to test that. You want to make sure you can do that, and the best way to do that is to run tabletop exercises to test both your detection and response. Know who and when you're going to call. Make sure that your PR team and your HR team are part of your incident response plan, so they know who's going to get called, when they're going to get called, what the message is. You want to keep the whole company on the same message, and plan for the worst case scenario and hope that it never comes to that. Hope that you never are a victim of ransomware, and that you're able to be successful and your detections actually work as advertised. Once again, I want to thank you all for coming. I really hope you all enjoyed this session, and the next session is going to be even better. So really looking forward to that. I'm gonna turn it over to you, David, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, great job, Alan. We do have some reader questions, and we'll get to those in a second. First, I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get to the Q&A box, and we'll handle these in the order they were sent in. First come, first served. Okay, I don't know if you want to follow along in the Q&A box. First question comes from Donald. He put this in when you were talking about China and Iran doing these kinds of disruptive attacks. He asks, are terrorists being funded by ransomware?
Not that I'm aware of. It's certainly possible. It's a connection that we haven't made yet. We know that, for example, North Korea uses ransomware, among other things, to fund the regime. We know that in Iran, in some cases, they are actually collecting ransom from like Moses staff and other ransomware variants, and that is partially being used to fund it. So I don't know that of any terrorist activities. One thing about running a ransomware operation is you need a relatively stable network and a relatively stable internet connectivity, and a lot of the terrorist activities don't. So I don't think terrorists are being funded, but you never know as it continues to grow. It is certainly a powerful form of revenue.
Okay. Next question comes from Ernesto. He asks, what is the name of the service you just mentioned to check for stolen credentials, eternally available domains?
The service is called Have I Been Pwned? It's Have I Been PWNED, I think is what it is, if you just search for that. But it's a free service. You put in your domain, and you'll get regular reports if you've ever had credentials exposed in a credential dump. Fantastic free service. It's run by a former Google security team member, and whose name I'm blanking on right now. A really, really great service. I highly recommend it.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Ethan. He says, out of all preventive measures, what one do you find we should prioritize?
Right now, I'd say you're going to get the most bang for your buck if you implement organizational-wide multi-factor authentication. I used to say vulnerability management was probably the number one, but I think multi-factor authentication is going to really go a long way toward keeping you safe. And then whatever you do, the domain controller and Active Directory is central to the ransomware actor's plan of attack. So whatever additional protections you can put around your domain controllers and your Active Directory structure, that's going to go a long way to keeping the ransomware actor out. So kind of I know you asked for one, but those are kind of the two big things that I would look at to start with.
Okay, great. Questions are rolling in. I'd like to remind the audience we still have several minutes, so keep them coming. This is great to have a lot of audience interaction. Next question comes from Steve. He says he missed the explanation on don't call the cops. Can you please elaborate?
Yeah, so I didn't actually explain that one just because we were running short on time. I'm glad you asked about that. There have been several different ransomware groups that have stated publicly that if you call the FBI or you call in a ransomware negotiator or even a third-party incident response and they find out about it, they will delete all of your files. So you won't be able to get the files back, and they'll delete all of your keys, so you won't be able to recover the files left. You won't be able to recover files. You'll have to restore from backup or whatever. So basically, they're going out of their way to telling you not to get involved. It's a little bit of an empty threat. One, they have no way of knowing whether or not you do, and it feels like it's something out of a bad 90s cop show where the kidnapper says if you call the cops, they'll lose an arm or something like that. It's a somewhat empty threat, but it is something that they're making, and we've seen them kind of act on it, where they'll say, oh, this organization bought in a negotiator, and so we deleted their keys, and here's all the files that we stole from them available for anybody to come in. Again, I wouldn't worry too much about it. A good negotiator is going to be, no different than talking directly to you if you have to talk to the ransomware actor.
Okay. Here's an interesting question from Matt in the audience. He asks, is there a ransomware calculator to show our clients the financial loss if they become a victim?
There are quite a few of them out there. I don't have one that I recommend over the other because every organization is a little bit different. And so, one of the things that I think is important to emphasize when you're talking to your clients is that whether you pay the ransom or don't pay the ransom, there is a lot of cost involved. Because even if you pay the ransom, you still have a lot of work to do to make sure the ransomware actor is not in there. And in fact, it's really important that there was a report from Cylance last year that said something like 80% of ransomware victims who pay the ransom are reinfected within 2 months. Oftentimes because what they do is they get the key, they restore the files, and they think it's fine, but they don't actually get rid of any of the of the legacy things that the ransomware actor left behind, the command and control stuff, the Cobalt Strike, and so on. So it's fairly easy for the ransomware actor to sort of waltz back in. So either way, there is recovery. Again, I don't have a specific calculator that I recommend, but there are a lot of really good ones out there. And it is a really expensive proposition to have to go through and clean that, because it's not just the ransomware attack that you have to recover from itself. It's all of the technical debt that you've built up over the years, all of the things that you've been putting off for years to get done that now have to get done because of the ransomware attack.
All right. Next question comes from Adam. When you talk to clients, do many of them have offline or hard copy recovery procedures and response plans? I'm thinking of the Kaseya attack, where many MSPs were caught out when their backups were unavailable because the servers that hold the keys were encrypted, even though the backup servers were not.
They certainly do when I leave. Adam, you are spot on there that too many organizations have relied on software-only backup and software-only recovery plans that do get encrypted during an attack. But I can show, and one of the things that I love is looking at the DFIR report. That's dfirreport.com. And they show you what the ransomware actors do during sort of that attack process. And you can show clients, hey, look, here's where they were looking for the backup server in there. They're trying to encrypt your online backups. You have to have something. We're supposed to follow the 3-2-1 rule in backup. That's 3 copies on 2 different media, one of which is offline. And I am a big fan of that. Note that that is not a way to prevent a ransomware attack. That doesn't mean you're not going to get hit with ransomware. All that means is you will be able to recover, but you need to think about that. And same thing for your incident response and your disaster recovery plans. There should be offline copies of those. If you want to keep it on a thumb drive, that's fine. If you want to actually print it out and put it in a binder, that's fine. But both times, whether it's on a thumb drive or a binder, please make sure you're updating those offline copies regularly. I joked, or not joked, it's the truth, but I've made the comment before that I have literally walked into an incident response and found the printed up incident response plan and literally wiped dust off of the binder because it hadn't been touched in so long. So really, really important to keep that offline, and I love the way you're thinking there, Adam.
All right. Time for one more question to squeeze in here, and it comes from Jonathan. Can you briefly explain how remote control apps are being used in reconnaissance and exfiltration?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ransomware actors like to use the same things that you like to use for remote controls. They will load up portable RDP executables, and they'll use that. They'll use TeamViewer. That's a real popular one. They'll have a portable executable of that that's in their little kit, and they'll connect into that. They don't like to use the command line. They like to use these remote apps. And so basically what they'll do is when they get on a machine, they will have their loader do a call out to their command and control. The command and control will download whatever that remote viewer is and execute it, and then they'll connect into that server. Or they'll call out. They'll have it call out to a listening open server. And then that's what they use to move around the network, so they feel like they're actually part of the network rather than trying to do everything from the command line. Personally, I think that's dumb. Like, I feel like, if you're trying to be stealthy, that's the worst way in the world to do it, but that's what a lot of the ransomware groups prefer. So if you look for things like TeamViewer, Network Traffic Assist, if you don't regularly use TeamViewer or RDP coming out of your network, if that's not something that's regularly supposed to be used, that can be a great detection mechanism.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Alan, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I really appreciate everybody's time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session.
Okay, everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Best Practices for Ransomware Remediation and Recovery, featuring John O'Neill Sr. and moderated by my esteemed colleague, John K. Waters, the Edward R. Murrow of tech journalism and podcasting. So hang tight, take a break, check out those resources in your console provided by Rubrik, and we'll be right back.
Thanks, Paula. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to today's summit, Modern Ransomware Defense and Remediation. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, AWS Insider, and Virtualization and Cloud Review, and made possible by our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust data management company. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for today's second information-packed session. Just a reminder that this session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, but be sure to type your questions into the Q&A box as they occur to you. Also, our sponsor, Rubrik, has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And don't forget, at the end of the third session, actually it's at the end of this session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Microsoft Surface Pro built on the Intel Evo platform Core i7. This beautiful tablet has a 13-inch screen, 16 gigs of memory, and a 256 gigs of solid-state storage. It's a beauty, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our second session, Best Practices for Ransomware Remediation and/or Recovery. For this session, we've called on John O'Neill, Senior Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. That's John O'Neill Sr. Just to be clear, his frequent partner in crime, David Kawula, couldn't be with us today. During his 2 decades in the IT industry, Mr. O'Neill has held roles ranging from software architect to senior executive, consultant to author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He's developed technology training courseware for Pluralsight, and he's authored material for both Thomas Reuters' Aspitor books and Exec Blueprints. He's one of our favorites. I know you're in for a great session. Take it away, John.
Hey, thank you so much, John. It's a real pleasure to be here for the John Squared show today, since it's John and John. As you mentioned, Dave is in the friendly skies, so he can't be here today, but he's here in spirit, and he definitely helped create the deck that we're going to go through today. So again, thank you for that great introduction and having us here, but we're going to get right to it now and talk about some of the current threats that we're looking at, because really the ransomware malware landscape is changing almost day to day. Okay, so what we're seeing in the landscape today is not the same thing that we saw 12 months ago. So, just the change in 2019 to 2020, 2020 to 21, and then 2021 to 2022 is huge. The types of malware, the types of ransomware, they have the same modalities, right? So ransomware is the same thing as always. Its goal is to encrypt everything on your network and force you into a position of paying them. But there's a little bit of change as we get into the current situation where we have a lot of focus on state-sponsored attacks. So just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen warnings from U.S. agencies ranging from the Department of Homeland Security to the FBI regarding two major governments, two major countries, Russia and China. And for anybody that keeps up with this, they'll know that, for instance, FBI Director Wray gave a talk in California, and he specifically mentioned China and sources of attacks, and that they're opening new cases at the FBI daily. Some things we have to worry about there is that China is now looking at launching some attacks that are designed solely to disrupt and slow, and they're willing to take on even impacting their own economy to do that. And, we know from historical precedent and other things that many of our daily items have production facilities in China. And the Chinese government can go into those facilities and possibly embed code on chips that the vendor doesn't even know. So, one thing that I put out there in the realm of possibility now with some of this is iPhones have been largely immune to installed malware because of the controls that Apple has in place with the Apple Store and other things. But what if during the production of the chips themselves, some malware was embedded? That would be a real problem. And with millions of these things sold, in a year, that's a pretty wide impact. So we really have to watch that. And then on the other hand, we have the warnings about Russia and the fact that with the current situation and the instability in the Ukraine region with Russia, that Russia may retaliate against Western nations, U.S. being included, with state-sponsored cyber attacks. Okay, and these can take the form of malware. And one thing that I get into a lot with people is we talk about ransomware as unique in that they want money, but that may just be a means to an end. They may not actually be trying to fund anything like an actual criminal that's out there waiting to get a big payday. They may be just using it as a tool to guarantee a certain level of response and that kind of thing, because we're going to talk about this later on in the session. When it comes to ransomware, cyber insurance acts in a very specific way, and we'll talk about that. So if I'm a malicious entity, nation, terrorist group, whatever, and I want to have that methodology followed, I'm gonna try and launch a ransomware attack, even though I really don't care whether you pay me or not. So there's some nefarious thinking going on there. And of course, then we still have the current threats that we've had, or we still have currently the threats that we've had for ages now, and those would include, insider threats, disgruntled employees, that sort of thing, social engineering attacks that take advantage of naive employees. All those still exist, and they present openings for threat actors or, malicious actors that are trying to gain access to your network, whether it be to discover information, to implant malware, to ransom your events. It doesn't matter. They're just trying to get in, and ultimately that results in disruption to your operation. So, moving on to the next slide. Let's talk about how, the approach we've taken over the last few years doesn't work as well today in 2022. And that approach was, hey, let's focus on preventative measures only, right? Let's really just try and wall up the defenses, add fences to the perimeter and that sort of thing. Well, a couple things here change that. First off, no one that I deal with anymore has a defined network perimeter. The network perimeter is wherever the user happens to be, and COVID kicked that into high gear, with our rush to remote work for a lot of organizations that weren't there, that hadn't really, taken on the remote work mantle. Well, they did when COVID came because they had no real choice. So now every organization's network perimeter isn't clearly defined. So if you're simply trying to firewall and do all those conventional things, there's a very high likelihood you're going to miss something, and that's the opening that the attacker is going to find. And remember this point, and that is that the attacker gets to spend 100% of their working effort at finding a vulnerability to get through and penetrate your defenses. I don't know any IT pro today that gets to spend 100% of their resources, their time, their budget, their computing power, whatever you want to look at. They don't get to spend 100% of that just fending off the attacker. So it's, I liken it to, you're going to go play a football team, but the other team gets 3 extra players on the field at any one time. That makes your job of winning the game much more difficult. So we have to take new approaches and focus on the reality that is we probably have a high chance at some point of being breached. This doesn't mean we don't do those proactive things. I'm not saying that at all, right? You want to keep that up and keep updating your firewalls and updating your IPS and IDS systems. All that still applies. What I'm saying is don't put 100% of your eggs in that basket, because then you'll be unprepared when something happens. And, looking at the details on the slide, there's a couple facts that we want to keep in mind as we look at this. One, statistically, malware that fires off ransomware or other types of attacks tends to live within a network for 45 days before it activates. So it's been there for a month and a half by the time it actually delivers its payload. And the reason for that is all the things Alan spoke about in his previous session, things like, hey, we want to corrupt and encrypt your backup systems. We want to make sure that, those remote workers get a chance to connect in and get also infected so that they don't live safely because they've been out of touch for a week or that kind of thing. We want to give enough time to our malware to, really infect and spread and get as big a demographic as possible before the payload erupts. And that's why we say there's a good chance if you have an attack in the next week or 2 weeks, it had been there for quite a while. And there may be some form of malware already living there today that simply hasn't been activated. It's just trying to spread. Because we have multiple threat vectors we didn't have before. We talked about the remote work and that sort of thing. Well, just imagine, somebody's a teenage child. I have 5 kids myself, so I know this one. They come home with a USB thumb drive that their friend loaded a cool new game on or utility on, and they plug it into my work computer because that's the one that's fired up and available on the counter. And guess what? I just introduced some malware into the system. So we have different threat vectors to think about these days. Now, when we talk about the models that we're going to recover from in a modern event, we have the most common, which is the partial breach. Something on your network was affected, but it doesn't shut you down. It doesn't stop 100% of your operations, and it offers you the most capability to work around it and keep the impact to a minimum for your employees, your stakeholders, your partners, your customers, all those folks. Full breach means that they have control of the system, they've locked you out, and your organization is pretty well shut down. You're not in control of how much impact is exposed to your customers, employees, that kind of thing. The attacker is at that point. And then we have the end of day scenario. And the end of day scenario is really the full breach with the fact that our backups are now engaged and corrupted, and we have to kind of go and build everything back from scratch. And that's just horrifying when people end up with that, because I can't tell you how many organizations don't even know where their original software that they have loaded for some of their legacy apps or their line of business applications exists. It's kind of like when Alan mentioned in the previous session about looking at the playbook or the binder, and he's got to wipe the dust off. It's at least they know where the binder is. Half of them don't know where their software install media is, and that can be a problem. So, those are our scenarios. And by the way, everyone, I love this to be an interactive session. So if you have questions, you don't need to wait until the end. Pop them into the Q&A panel, and we'll talk about them as we go. I really love for this to be a dynamic conversation. And even if we, get away from some of the topics on the slide, that's great. This session is designed for you. The lovely folks at Redmond Magazine and our sponsors are trying to give you the best content. So you ask your questions, and we'll do our best to get them answered. Something that is part of the new reality is the acknowledgement that recovery is much slower than typically organizations estimate. And this is why testing your recovery plan is a critical part of your DR strategy. If you just estimate and you never put it to the test, you're hoping that your guess is spot on. And if you guess anything like I do, that's very unlikely to happen. With a last name like O'Neill, it's pretty apparent I'm Irish, and I have Irish luck, which means I have bad luck. So I don't like to guess on anything. I like to actually run recovery tests at scale and then record the time frames and go from there so that I understand that I'm going to be able to meet my recovery time objective and my recovery point objective and those kind of things. So in addition to that, because modern scenarios often involve hybrid cloud connectivity, and in fact, we suggest that we love hybrid cloud connectivity because it offers some advantages that we're going to talk about through this session, but it also limits your recovery to the bandwidth available. Not just the bandwidth available from your ISP, but the bandwidth available from your cloud provider. You don't have their wide open pipe, they have that throttle. So, a couple suggestions that we have in here is that, you need to develop relationships with your ISP, okay? Call them, have them come in and sit down around the conference table, have a lunch meeting, whatever. Have a relationship with them so that you have an actual person that you can call and, that will help you get your bandwidth turned up in the event of a crisis like a disaster. Because if you have, let's say, 400 meg connectivity, and it's on a fiber connection, with a single call to your ISP, you can often get that bursted to 1 gig or better. And if you have a relationship with that ISP, in most cases that we've been a part of over the last 12 months, we've been able to get that bursted at no extra expense. Everybody thinks, oh my goodness, they're going to charge me a fortune. No, if you have a relationship with them and you call them and you're like, look, I've got a breach, I've been ransomware, I need to recover and I need to get it up fast, they're a partner. They're going to help you. And they want you to be back up and running because, you're also a customer of theirs and they want that long-term recurring revenue. So the longer you're down, the more that's at risk. So get that relationship built. And if it's a big multi-state or national carrier and you're thinking, oh, how do I develop a relationship with them? Well, odds are they have a local sales rep, a sales office. Just get yourself as best as you can a scenario where you have a person that you can call when emergency strikes. And likewise, find out the number to your cloud provider so that you can open up a support ticket with them and ask them to increase the bandwidth on their end. Because I know we've dealt with this a lot with both Microsoft and Amazon, and with fairly straightforward support tickets, they were able to turn up the bandwidth and increase the rate at which we were able to pull our recovery down. Fabric. What is a fabric? Well, a fabric is a separate identity management domain where we put things such as our hypervisors. So that's where your Hyper-V hosts live or your ESX hosts, those types of things. And why do we do that? Well, it's the same reason why when you call in and you open up a support ticket for Microsoft 365, those folks that you're talking to don't have access to actually be able to get into the underlying hypervisor. They don't have access to be able to get in and, reboot the hosts that are hosting your SQL or your Azure SQL instance. They don't. They need to open that up with another department, and that department has access into those things, and the number of individuals in that department is limited, so it's less likelihood of exposure or breach. You want to do that same kind of thing in your environment. So you're going to have your production domain, your production forest, and in that you have all your normal IT folks, their admin accounts. A few of them have domain admin accounts and that sort of thing. But you're also going to have a fabric where your hypervisors live and possibly your backup targets and those kind of things. And in that fabric, you're going to have even a lesser group that has access to that fabric. And often they're shared resources, so it's an IT person that has access in the production and the fabric, but of course, since they're separate forests, separate domains, the credentials are completely different. This way, if an attacker gets in and fully compromises your identity management system, so every one of your domain controllers is down, your accounts is locked out, you can still get to the underlying hypervisor and fire up replicas or restore backups of VHDXs, those kind of things, much quicker than if that all lived in one identity management frame. And then we also often recommend connecting that to a separate Azure tenant, again, for the same reason. A lot of folks that are for instance, using Azure virtual desktops or servers in Azure. They have a domain controller up in Azure. They have all these things. So pervasive malware or ransomware could get access to those things. If I connect to a separate tenant, and that separate tenant is where I house my offsite backups, so maybe I have a backup up in blob storage or that kind of thing, I'm able to get access to it. I'm able to bring it down. I'm able to do all that, even though my main production environment has been compromised, fully compromised. And you really do need to go with the concept of zero trust. So assume you've been breached and you're taking actions based on that. So you're creating separation so that, hey, if the breach is over here on my right, I can't get to over here on my left, that sort of thing. And that's what all this is about. Do the same thing with your network. Create separate VLANs so that you can understand where traffic is moving and going, and use ACLs and that sort of thing in your switches, your routers, your firewalls, so that you can filter down to just the type of traffic that you want to move from the host you want to move it. That allows you to control and monitor and have great visibility into what's happening. So if you're only moving files on a certain port, and all of a sudden you see traffic that's coming on a different protocol or port, you could use that to fire off an alert and go investigate. Maybe you have things limited so that the backup comes from one host on your production and moves to another host on your fabric. Well, all of a sudden you see traffic that's coming from an IP that you don't recognize on your production network. Again, fire off alert, go investigate it. So you want to put these processes in place now to ease the recovery later. So, Kelly, thank you. You got a great question here, and let's take a minute and talk about that. Can you talk about attribution in ransomware attacks? What can be provided to the public as evidence? So, I think I know where Kelly's going with this, but I'm not sure. She can correct me if I'm wrong, or he can correct me. When we talk about this, and a great one was the Kaseya attack. So a lot of people were part of that. They might have had a managed service provider that was impacted. I know we dealt with a lot of remediation for it, for a couple very large MSPs. That attack occurred last year, and we were able to get copies of some of the INI files that were corrupted by the ransomware itself, and it shows that they were actively targeting anything with the name backup in it. So they're looking at folders and things like that with the word backup in them. Obviously, that tells us exactly what we expect. They're trying to corrupt the backup so we can't restore from them. But because they published that now to the public, that allows us to have that evidence and say, hey, we need to go through and rename our backup folder structure because it's using that backup name. Or we need to rename our backup file names because they have, backup-date in them, anything like that. So by publishing that evidence, we are able to, as a whole, as IT professionals as a whole, learn lessons. And, really that's what all of IT is about is, hey, let's analyze, let's adapt, and let's overcome. And that's what we're doing here is we take that and we learn and we overcome. And if you think about it, that's kind of how virus protection existed for many, many years is you'd have certain people get infected, and then the antivirus firms would use those infections, the data they got from them, to create the signature files that prevented others from getting infected. And so we're kind of doing the same thing now. Okay. So one of the reasons why we suggest another tenant is that when you have a compromise in your production level domain and that account that holds your global admin rights is compromised, they can really, really hose up your cloud operations. Everything from backups to things like Azure SQL instances to your Exchange Online configurations to everything. And that's huge. When you have a separate tenant, it has a completely different global admin, and that global admin account is attached to the separate identity management system that is your fabric. So it protects you against the loss of a global admin. It also allows you to do things like temporarily lock out your global admin account when you notice a breach so that you can get the lay of the land and determine if it was compromised, but still have access to your backups that live in that other tenant. There's a few technologies that really come into play when we talk about being able to fast recover and be able to limit impact of attackers once they get in. And I listed them here. And JIT-GIA is a big one that you'll hear from people, from Microsoft folks. And JIT-GIA really gives you the ability to give just the access rights required for a specific operation. So let's say create a user account in a specific OU. And the JIT part, the just-in-time part, applies that privilege only for the period of time necessary to actually create the account. Once the action is done, the privilege is stripped back and doesn't exist anymore. And GIA is a really great concept in my mind because it doesn't require creating an administrative account. What actually happens is this temporary virtual account is spun up and it lives with only those rights required for only that period of time. And then it never exists again. So even if that virtual account's GUID was compromised or exposed, it would have no value whatsoever because the account is gone when the action is over. And then when we talk about privileged account management, we want to talk about things like role-based access control. That's huge. Define what your accounts can do based on the role that they're taking on. So an Exchange admin, for instance, shouldn't and doesn't need access to be able to log on or change your SQL Server settings. Okay? They don't tend to share that same role. And if you separate the accounts and you assign them based on the role they're filling, one, it makes it easier for you to define exactly which particular operations a specific account needs. And two, it allows you to spin up new teammates or outside consultants so that they can help you in the event of a recovery, since that's really what we're talking about here, much faster, rather than you having to kind of piece that together and piecemeal them in there. So, Ash has thrown out a question: would the size of file attract the hackers? Absolutely. So attackers are typically purveyors of information, details, right? And so we think back to the era of Kevin Mitnick and his early cyber attacks and that kind of thing, and most of his success came through social engineering, right? Or dumpster diving and finding, printouts that had account information and that sort of thing. And so what's that all about? Well, it's about collect as much information you can and start to put it together like a puzzle. And eventually you put enough pieces of a puzzle together and you start to get a picture of what it represents. And so when an attacker comes in and they look for everything that, say, has the word backup in it, they know that, a few kilobyte file, it may have some value, but it's certainly not your actual backup file. But all of a sudden a file pops up that is, a terabyte in size. That is a pretty good target to have a replica of an entire machine. And if it has, the data from an entire machine and they can crack that backup file or corrupt that backup file, they gain a big edge. So what we've seen is attackers often look for, before you're compromised, they'll look for that very large backup file and then try and gain access to it so that they can kind of offline, if you will, or without your active daily use systems being able to sense their activity, they can poke around inside the backup file if they've cracked it and look for any information they can use to then corrupt your live system. And Kelly came back and helped clear it up, so this is great, right? And mentions, for example, the recent pipeline attack. Media quickly named a Russian hacker group. With unprecedented level of distrust in media, some sort of evidence that IT security journalists could translate for the public would be very useful. And so this is where we get into the challenge of doing what's right versus what's easy versus what's profitable. And so let's talk a bit about cyber insurance. And, the way cyber insurance works, obviously, is to try and offset the losses incurred by an organization that is affected by ransomware or malware or, a straight-out cyber attack, DDoS even. And the insurance company is a for-profit group, so they want to minimize the amount that they have to pay back. So they do certain things. And one of them is that they actually are iffy sometimes, in my experience, in wanting you to release too much information to others because that may cause them, for instance, in this scenario, that Russian hacker group that was mentioned immediately disbanded, but its members came back under a different name using the same attacks. And so we've seen them more, but they're technically a different name, so they're maybe not spotted immediately. They're not on the same terrorist watch group, so now you can possibly pay them ransomware because a lot of threat actors, they know that, for instance, in the U.S., if they are on a terrorist watch list, you can't pay them whether you want to or not because you would be funding terrorism. That's a big no-no and very illegal. So if they're on that group by name and their malware is identified to them, they're not making any money. So they'll just change their name, they'll change some of their signatures and that sort of things that are in the file and move on. So there's a certain amount of points where the insurance carriers that I was mentioning or others don't really want you to publish too much because then it creates those problems. But on the other hand, you have exactly what we talked about earlier. You have IT pros that are like, hey, we want to help others because in helping others, we help ourselves. So the more information we get out there about this attack, the more others can prevent it. The more we can learn about similar attacks, the more we can prevent that. So I think you're going to find a mixed bag. And I had a whole lot of words there to not give a very clear answer because I don't think there is a very clear answer. I think it's going to greatly depend upon the attack, the breadth of the attack, and the nature of the attack. State-sponsored, I think that we can depend on that once it's identified to become fairly publicized. So understanding origin and modalities and that sort of thing. When it's small ransomware groups and it's, impacting at scale a small subsection of organizations, I think insurance companies may not publish that as fast as we would like, but, that's more guess than anything. And then Stephen threw in, what about legal obligations to disclosure the release of sensitive data? And this is another one. And this is why when you have recovery to a modern event, it is messy, okay? Because you have a bunch of people that know their part, but they don't necessarily know or even take into account the parts others have to play. For instance, you've been ransomed, and, you pretty much should assume, in my mind, that if you've been ransomed and they've encrypted your data, that they had access to all your data, so they may have read it. Now, of course, forensic analysts will try to determine that after the fact, but that can take days, weeks, even months in some cases. And during that period of time, your legal department needs to be consulted because you may have some obligation to notify people impacted. For instance, if you're a medical provider and we're talking about the medical records of, thousands of individuals, you may very well have a legal obligation to notify them that there's a potential breach of their data. Same thing if you're holding financial information for your employees, for instance, and you do direct deposits and all these kind of things out of your payroll system, and that's possibly breached. You may have an obligation legally to let your employees know that their bank account data was exposed, right? You can't just wait for their bank account to be touched and then possibly they come back on you. So you've got that. And then you have, we'll talk for a second about this, beyond the legal, you might have a moral or ethical obligation, in those same scenarios. So let's say there isn't a legal obligation to let your employees know, but if you're a good employer, I think you'd want your teammates to realize that, hey, your username and password may have been exposed. If you're using that on other systems like your online banking, your healthcare system, whatever, you probably want to change your password. We don't know the level of exposure, those kind of things, but I feel that there's an obligation there to be transparent. Lots of folks will disagree with me, and that's fine. That's great. But the legal, that's one for your legal department to answer, and I always recommend engaging legal as fast as you engage the insurance company because they might not realize, the two of them, of what your obligations are, so make sure you have them both working. And, we're going to talk for a moment about advanced persistent threat protection, okay? And many of the products actually have ATP in their name, advanced threat protection in their name. But it's a piece of a solution. When we talk about composites, this is the analogy I like to use. A composite is anything where the components that make it up produce a whole that is stronger or has more valuable properties than the individual components. So by that definition, a cake is a composite. Now, personally, I do not pour myself a big bowl of flour and start eating. I don't think I'd enjoy that. However, that flour once added to a bunch of other components like eggs and different things to produce a cake, if you've ever seen me out at a restaurant or on the treadmill trying to work off my belly, you'd understand that I like the cake approach. So same kind of thing with advanced persistent threat protection. It's a component. It's part of a composite. Your protection scheme and your response scheme is a composite. It's built of parts. So don't just rely on ATP and wait for it to tell you something. Use other forms of analysis, and most of all, use your own instincts, experience, and knowledge. That's why you're the IT pro, because you have something invaluable that can't be replicated. What you can do is rely on those systems to be able to analyze tens of thousands of data points in a period of time that is just impossible for the human mind, and then let you make decisions upon the composite picture that the analysis of all those data points put forward. Now, I do want to talk about something on this slide that we have there, and that's related to the CVEs. So the common vulnerability and exploits. These are what are published to identify and remediate security threats, right? And so CVEs may point to, hey, there's been version 1.1 of software released that plugs this hole that's present in version 1.0 that allows an attacker to do X, Y, and Z. But it also can point to things like, hey, when you install this software, it installs in this default config, and you need to go in and disable this feature and change this configuration and do this. And so these CVEs are being constantly published. And if you use things like ATP, I'll talk about Azure Defender 365, okay, and the ATP component for a second, because I have a lot of familiarity with that. So it will look at all your endpoints in pretty much real time, comparing them to the CVE database and showing you, hey, this endpoint is exposed to this many CVEs. And you're like, wow, there's 53 on this endpoint alone. How will I ever keep up on this? Well, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Your goal should be to close as many CVE holes as possible. And here's a big reason why. Because starting in late 2021, but certainly present now, a lot of the cyber insurance carriers are putting exclusions or riders on the policies that state that from the moment a security vulnerability is identified and a patch is released, from that moment, your limits of coverage are reduced, your liability is increased. And it's a sliding scale. So the longer it exists on your network, the lower your coverage is. And now they do word this, they say, if the attack is shown to have possibly leveraged that exploit. Well, here's the problem I have with that is in modern networks that have hundreds of desktops on them, and they're all plugged into the same network backbone, the same VLAN, that kind of thing, it would be fairly easy for an insurance company, in my mind, to put forward that, hey, this endpoint with this vulnerability may have contributed to the impact of this cyber event. And as soon as they do that, boom, your limits of coverage go down. So even though you think you have a $1 million policy, all of a sudden they're saying, no, the max we're going to cover is $250,000 because you had this on-patched software or on-patched CVE. And that's pretty huge. And what we've seen with a lot of carriers is there's a significant change at 30 days. So it starts immediately, and there's a reduction immediately. And then there's another reduction at around 30 days, and then they continue on this scale until 360 days later, so a year later. If you have something on your network, say it's a switch that's running firmware or software that they came out with a new version, but how many people don't touch their switches? They're up and running, leave them alone. and you haven't upgraded it in a few years, well, that network switch could possibly be responsible for reducing your level of coverage by 25% or much greater, all the way up to, we've seen 75%. So that's that case of a $1 million policy becomes a max $250,000 policy. And then all the other riders kick in and everything else. You could basically end up with no coverage simply because you're running unpatched, end-of-life, end-of-support equipment. And they are getting much more specific about that, folks, where they're calling out if it's unsupported by its manufacturer, it's uncovered and it reduces your limits of coverage. If it's end of life, which pretty much is end of support, same kind of thing, it's in the same category. So understand when the end of sale date is for your hardware. Understand when it goes end of life, so end of support. Because end of sale obviously usually occurs well before the end of support. But if you don't know these dates and start developing a plan, you end up trying to spend a bunch of money or getting budget approval for things in a very short period of time, when in reality, you could be planning them out for replacement 2 or 3 years down the road. You can make that roadmap. So Stephen points out that much of the discussion assumes that institutions have control or management access to all the devices on their networks. What about universities which have more student computers on their networks than institutionally owned and managed devices? So thanks for bringing that up, Stephen. That's a great point. And this is where we get into don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Protect as much as you can. Implement things like separate VLANs on your infrastructure. Control the ports that you allow access through, and do these kind of things rather than wide open networks that anybody can connect to. You can do things like be transparent, explain these things with your carriers, ask questions, ask them to lay out what that impact will be, okay? Transparency is your friend, partnerships are your friend. But don't get caught up in the what you can't do because you can't change that. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of places where you can't change certain data points. But then we focus on the things we can change and the things we can do. And I've even seen where some organizations or parts of organizations, they're so disjointed or compartmentalized because they're so large that there's even different things happening on sub-networks than on the main network, and that's okay. The more you protect, the better off you are. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So I'm kind of going along here, so we have a few more slides, but I love the questions that are coming in, and that's great. Security baselines. These are things that you can take advantage of. Most of your major vendors and a number of independent agencies, some you have to pay for, some are freely available, whether it be CIS or other organizations. You can go to them and they will take a given product and tell you these are the things you should do to end up from the default environment to a more secure environment. Take advantage of those. What this does is it allows you to free up all the time it would take you on research and identification and testing and start with a secure footprint much quicker than you would otherwise. Your cyber ops team. Now, many organizations don't have the budget or the management support or that kind of thing to form a dedicated group or even have a single IT pro that is dedicated to cybersecurity. And that's unfortunate, but it's the reality. And again, we're going to focus on what we control, not what we can't control. So what you can do is you can, amongst the team you have, say, what can we do? Can each of us take on a different area of this and create something that improves our scenario? So, you have somebody that says, okay, well, I'll take on, I'm the network admin, so I'll take on looking at alerts for odd activity through our ACLs, okay? And you have somebody else that's, hey, I'm in the desktop support team, so I'll take on looking at those CVE analysis that come out of our ATP solution. And, the thing that we should do is, as we break that up, is we should set some sort of communication framework and plan in place so that we're sharing that information and it's not just extra activity for no benefit. And what I usually recommend is, depending on your needs and your organization, anything from, a daily stand-up to a weekly stand-up, where you just get together, the team you form, and share what you've seen, what you've done, that sort of thing, and analysis for what you can do to continue to shore it up. Because as I mentioned right at the beginning, the current threat landscape is changing day to day. And, we talked about state-sponsored. If, for instance, things go south and Russia invades Ukraine and they release a bunch of cyber attacks, malware, that sort of thing, obviously what we're talking about becomes very different, because now our priorities change to defending that off. So, what we're working on today could get put on hold very quick. And one thing that is super valuable to you now is engage your management and be transparent with them that, it's like anything else they pay insurance for. They pay property insurance to protect them against a fire, a flood, a broken sprinkler head out on the plant floor, a forklift that drives off the loading dock, whatever. They consider it valuable enough to pay insurance for that or invest money in preventing that. And they're going to need to do the same for cybersecurity. They're going to need to increase the spend that you have. And if that isn't dedicated employees, it could be things like third-party experts, so Microsoft threat experts. That is a division within Microsoft that is a bunch of very dedicated, very high-level resources that just focus on threat protection that you can engage at a moment's notice to help you analyze activity you're seeing, or attacks, or vectors, or all these different things. And so get that buy-in early. Don't wait until an attack and then go ask for money to try and deal with it, because then you've got a lot more going on, and you're asking for it in a big hurry. And typically, in my experience, it's a lot harder to try and force somebody into a position of, let's go spend this today without giving me a chance to think about it or analyze it. Usually, if you force an answer, the answer is no. So do it early and often, and let them ask you questions and get that increase in budget. And you're probably going to be going back to them year after year because the threat landscape's changing. So let them know that right now also. This isn't a one-time deal. So ransomware remediation. There are a number of things that you can do to help this. And, one is the kill switch. So this is how you can, collapse the network or collapse the devices or lock out the accounts very rapidly to prevent spread. So I call this the chipmunk in the house scenario. If I have a wild chipmunk that's gotten in my house and I'm trying to find it and get rid of it, leaving all my bedroom doors open and closet doors and bathroom doors just makes it so much more challenging for me. So one of the first things I do is close all those doors, so now I limit the rooms in the house where the chipmunk can be. Then my remediation becomes easier because my landscape has become smaller. The amount of area I have to cover is smaller. So have kill switches in place that allow you to do that. Things like, quickly tearing down tunnels between multiple locations and that sort of thing. Be able to do that. Use technologies like Windows Autopilot that are quickly able to wipe and reload or reset systems in infected areas. Recover, because they use a base configuration, so you're able to recover them to a usable state very quickly. Take advantage of your PowerShell scripting and the Intune Graph API, so for Endpoint Manager if you're using that. And now let's talk about desktop backups. A lot of people don't focus on desktops because they're like, hey, we've been told for years, let's just focus on our servers and make sure people are storing there. Well, the problem is that same remote work surge that I mentioned earlier with COVID, lots of people are breaking the old rules and storing important organizational data on their desktops. So if you're not backing them up, you increase the likelihood that you will have loss. And loss is bad. That's the whole reason we have a backup and recovery system and strategy. So if you can, if you have the space available on your backup targets, if you can get the budget to expand your blob storage and backup into Azure, back those desktops up. At least your core employee desktops, so the desktops of your executives, of your accounting team, right? The payroll person, the HR manager, those folks. Redirect their folders to things like OneDrive for Business or their cloud storage so that when they think they're saving it to their local documents folder, it's actually getting somewhere in the cloud where you can have a backup of it and that sort of thing. So that's huge. Now, immutability. I'm going to talk for a moment about immutability and what it means. Immutability is simply unchangeable. So we want to have a backup that is a write once, so when the backup actually occurred, and not allow any more writes. That way, if ransomware comes in, if malware comes in and gets a hold of the location where my backup is, tough. It can't actually write any changes to the backup file or the backup system. So a lot of your backup solutions out there, your commercial solutions out there, will have immutable solutions now as part of their system, and that's great. Some of them have immutable appliances that are built so that once it's written, it can't be overwritten, that sort of thing. But you can also use techniques to take advantage of your current systems without change. One that we put in place a lot is we will put a backup target that is behind a specific network port, and that network port is in a state of disabled normally, so it's off. No traffic can occur beyond it. And oftentimes, we will even shut the backup target, the server, off itself, and then we'll send a command to the IPMI, or we'll turn on the port, first off, obviously, to enable connectivity to that backup target, and then turn on the server, write the backup, turn off the server, turn off the port. So the port is actually only enabled for a very short period of time through which the data can get through. So techniques like that give you the ability to create a semi-immutable situation, certainly more immutable than not. So that's huge. Okay, well, we're kind of running out of time, and I want to take at least one more question. Everybody's had some great questions today and comments. I appreciate that. There is a good question that came in from Michael. Best advice for getting client buy-in. And the best advice I have is transparency and data. So, be honest, okay? A lot of us are scared of, presenting the true facts because the true facts are scary, okay? But in the current landscape we're in, it's all right, and it's actually probably normal to be a little scared of it. And that doesn't mean we're terrified into inaction. It means that we have a true appreciation for the risks that are out there. And then the data part of it is show them the things that we talked about as far as cyber insurance carriers restricting, hey, end of support, end of life, reducing your amounts of coverage. Ask them what they would do if, they had a fire that wiped out their entire building and they went to use their insurance, and their insurance came back and said, well, we're only going to cover 25% of the loss because we found out that you had a really old valve on your sprinkler system, and we think that's the reason it didn't put out the fire. So, you paid us premiums for a $10 million policy, but we're only going to cover, $250,000 of it. And they'd be like, well, I sue them and whatever, and you'd still not have a building. So that's super important. And, just have conversations early and often. Don't try and make it a one meeting, get their buy-in, get their approval type thing. Make it reality. And here's the last tip I'm going to put forward on that is a lot of your insurance brokers, particularly those that deal with the legacy providers who deal with the very large policies. So in the cyber insurance marketplace right now, you've got two kind of carriers. You've got the legacy providers that tend to rate those much larger policy limits. And then you've got a bunch of kind of smaller providers that are offering insurance for very specific scenarios. They're looking at, hey, you're an organization that only has 10 users. Okay, so your limits of loss are going to be much less than a $1 billion company. So we're going to offer you coverage because the maximum amount we're going to be able to lose is probably a lot less with you. So whatever that case may be, but particularly with the larger ones, they have models where they've put in all the claims that they've paid and the types of scenarios around it. You can actually tell them, hey, we're a distribution company, $500 million a year. We have 12 locations. We burn at a rate of X amount of profit per week. They will plug all that in, and they'll come back to you and they'll say, hey, based on the current level of claims we've paid over the last 24 months, your estimated loss in a cyber event that involves ransomware is $6 million. So you need that kind of level of coverage. But engage them, partner with them. Okay, well, that's it. I'm at the top of the hour, so I'm going to turn it back to my good friend John. And thank you again, everyone, for your attention today.
Hey, thanks, John. That was a great session. Many thanks to John O'Neill Sr. for a great session and to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making this summit possible. And now my colleague, 1105 Media's intrepid project coordinator, Victoria Waba, has some closing announcements before she unveils the winner of that sweet Surface Pro 8. Victoria, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, John, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Waba, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I want to give a few closing announcements before we depart today. As you leave, you'll be asked to take a short survey with your opinions of this event. Please share those honest opinions. Our editors read every comment, and they help shape our future events. And speaking of future events, we really want to give a big thank you to Rubrik. They're sponsoring this event because they believe in this community and want to support events like these. So please show your support and appreciation by downloading their resources and visiting their site and contacting them for a demo. It's through their underwriting of these events that we can bring more summits in the future. They have provided a link to a demo in your audience console. It's to the right of the console, so please take a moment to check that out. So a big thank you to Rubrik. Thank you to our speakers, to our fellow moderators, and now let's draw the winner of our random prize. Congratulations to Ethan Shatika from McCanny Oil Company. You have won the Surface Pro 8 with 256 gigabyte of storage. Our team will be in touch with you on how to claim your prize. So that's it for the summit today. Thank you all so much. You will get a replay email in the next few days of the summit. And we hope you enjoy this event. Please do take the survey that pops up when you exit. Thank you, and thanks again to Rubrik. Have a wonderful rest of your day.